Now, ladies and gentlemen, there has been a slight change of plan, and I will just brief you very quickly on that. We had hoped to link up with Her Excellency Dr. Yasmin Fouad, who is the Environment Minister of the Arabic Republic of Egypt, but unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, she is unable to join. I will flag up two things, though, that are quite relevant. The next UN Climate Change Conference, COP27, is going to take place in her native Egypt, in the city of Sharm el-Sheikh later this year on November 7th until the 18th. And as raised earlier, Egypt is one of the countries that is directly impacted by the war in Ukraine, and it is heavily reliant on wheat imports from both Russia and the country that is known as the breadbasket of Europe. But now we regret, obviously, that Her Excellency could not join us, but as they say, the show must go on. So without further delay, I would like to now welcome Mr. Pascal Lamy, who is joining us online. Mr. Pascal Lamy, can you hear us and can you see us?
Yes, I can hear you fine, and I hope you can hear me fine.
I can hear you perfectly fine, Mr. Lamy. I'll just introduce you briefly. I'm sure you're no stranger to this forum. I had the pleasure of interviewing you a couple of years ago, as I'm sure my co-host Stephen did as well. Mr. Lamy is coordinator of the Jacques Delors think tanks in Paris, Berlin, Brussels, and also president of Paris Peace Forum. From 2005 until 2013, Pascal Lamy served 2 consecutive terms as Director General of the World Trade Organization. Hailing from France, you previously served as Trade Commissioner from 1999 until the year 2004. Also as Director General of Crédit Lyonnais from 1994 until 1999, and working very closely then, of course, with Geneviève Pons, when you were the Chief of Staff of the President of the European Commission, Mr. Jacques Delors, and of his G7 Sherpa group from 1985 until 1994. So a very impressive career, Mr. Lamy, no doubt about it. But on today's occasion, you are going to speak about the changing landscape in terms of international trade and the agri-trade environment. So without further ado, because I know you're on a tight schedule as well, I will hand the floor to you. Give us a brief introduction and then we'll follow up with some questions, Mr. Lamy. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to fill in for a good Egyptian friend who could not be there, and to precede 2 other friends in the end of the program, Amina Mohamed and Yanis Potoshnik. I'll start, as you suggested, by trying to place today's conversations on the future of agriculture in the context of the global international trends which have developed for some time. And in a nutshell, my simple point is that I believe that the agri-food, not just agri-food policy conversation has now shifted from where it was in the past, which was benefits and costs of protection of producers, to what it will be in the future, which is benefits and costs of what I call precaution, succeeding to protection, hence a very different ballgame. Now, for many decades, the main international debate was about protection of producers from foreign competition, tariffs, subsidies, a classical obstacle to trade, whereas the benefits of trade for industry or services were globally recognized. It was much more debated in the agro-food sector, not least because of price volatility. And this led to a specific trade regime where protection of producers was higher than in other sectors. This era, in my view, is now behind us, or more precisely, is moving behind us for one main reason, which is prices for agriculture and to some extent for food are on a medium long-term rise trend. This being due to the nutritional transition in developing countries. The good news is that more people have more money to spend on their food. The bad news is that this sometimes leads to inflation, but overall, this is good news for farmers. Now, that's the past. Let's now rapidly look at the future. I think we are now moving in what I call the era of the precaution, much more than protection, as I mentioned it. Producers are not the main constituency, the main issue in agri-food policy. What now matters is one, nature, two, health, and three, security. And this is the result of a series of evolutions, mostly crises. Of course, the environmental crisis, food health issues in many countries, COVID, of course, the present shock resulting from the invasion of Ukraine by Russia on agricultural and food markets. This, in my view, is the new set of objectives, of targets in addressing the model of future farming and food in the European Union. And this entails a transformation of the EU agro-food system, on which Europe Delors has started working last year, and which Geneviève Pons already mentioned this morning. Now, one is protecting nature, addressing the climate and biodiversity negative impacts of farming and of food chains. This means moving to a more regenerative farming model, addressing along the supply chain other issues. Main instruments to do that, incentives, as we subsidize agriculture within the European Union, and regulation. Number two, protecting health, which is addressing the root causes of a number of new diseases, what non-transmissible diseases, which are called civilizational diseases, such as excess of sugar, excess of chemical products in food, the whole impact on health and bodies. Main instrument to do that, regulation. And third, protecting food security in order to address fears which have grown because of recent crises about supply chain ruptures or fragilities. And this has to do with ensuring putting the necessary precautionary measures to ensure availability and affordability of food. This is, in my view, and I know it's a topic of discussion, very different from what many in Europe call food sovereignty or food self-sufficiency. In my view, food security is not synonym of self-sufficiency. Moving in this direction is part of my view in the Green Deal. This big transition will necessitate serious changes in the common agricultural policy, which so far, I think, have been significantly overlooked, I would say, diplomats. And so far, this also has to do with food regulation, in some cases with trade measures, in order not to put our producers in what I would call the precaution disadvantage. And there are fears, and some of them are legitimate, among our producers, that they would be victims of this precaution disadvantage, which would in a way replace the protection they had before. This, of course, is not just a farming issue, it's also a transformation issue, it's also a distribution issue, a consumption issue, hence the necessity to involve a whole range of stakeholders moving the common agricultural policy debate in a much larger spectrum of stakeholders, and this probably will be one of the major recommendations of the results of the Europe Delors work on food and agriculture in the European Union in the times to come. Over to you, and thanks for listening to the short presentation.
Thank you very much, Pascal Lamy, for that. I'm just going to pick up on one or two points, if I may, some interesting points raised. And of course, as I said at the outset, you were the WTO chief. You also served as trade commissioner. Can I pick your brains on the impact of the war in the Ukraine on the agri-food trade system? Has it exposed flaws in our current system? And what should the EU be doing? Let's stick just with the EU, we're in Brussels. What sort of contingency plans would you suggest should be put in place to cope with these shocks, to cope with these potential disruptions in the supply chain?
Well, I think it's unfortunately a very good example of what happens when global food markets are disrupted. The reality is that many countries on this planet rely on deep, well-functioning international markets to feed their population and keep food prices at a reasonable level. We are in a situation where this big shock will lead to food shortages, and this needs to be addressed. Within the European Union, I do mostly in Eastern and Central Europe, probably more worryingly outside the European Union, in North Africa, Egypt, the Middle East, where the main importers of Russian and Ukrainian cereals and staples. So overall, a big shock that will keep entertaining this conversation about food security, availability, and affordability. In terms of policy response, I think there is one within the European Union that helps mitigating this inflationary shock. And this is, in my view, a matter of security and solidarity. There's no reason Hungarians or the Baltics or the Poles would have a high price of food, whereas Italians, French, and Portuguese will not. And this, in my view, is part of the overall solidarity response of the European economy to the invasion of Ukraine. And then there is a larger international issue. My policy prescription, and that won't surprise anybody, is please resist export restrictions, which makes the problem worse, and think of what needs to be done in order to avoid this shock, to create famine and hunger in countries who were very dependent on Ukraine and Russian cereals.
Okay, thank you for that, Pascal Lamy. I have a question here from Eddie Wax at Politico, and I would just like to include that, a journalist here in Brussels with the Agri-Pro Politico newsletter. It's based on the French government, and the current French presidency of the European Council has been saying that the Ukrainian war, or the war in Ukraine, proves their food sovereignty push is correct. But Eddie's question is, isn't this the time to be keeping global markets open rather than focusing on food sovereignty? And as you know, the French presidency has been putting food sovereignty at the top of its political agenda. So what do you say to that, Pascal Lamy? Is this the time, you mentioned it there, that we should be limiting restrictions on exports. So how do you square that circle there? Something being pushed by the French government, as I say.
Yeah, as everybody knows, I'm French, but I don't always agree with the French on food and agriculture matters. I'm a bit more Nordic, so to say, in European terms. I make a difference between food security and food sovereignty. Food security is about providing food in proper quantities and at an affordable price. Food sovereignty is about producing what you eat. My experience, when I've been in this international trade system for quite a number of decades, is that my pragmatic experience, the lesson of experience, and I remember full well, for instance, the 2008 food crisis, is that an international restoration of markets where those who can produce and export, those who cannot produce but need to eat, import, is the best way to handle this system. And I'm also of the view that if you want to limit the negative impact of some food production systems on the environment, this is also the way to go. The day Saudi Arabia decided to stop producing wheat because of the huge draw it had on its water resources and buy food elsewhere was a rational decision. So I'm all in favor of food security, and I don't agree with the slogan that this is equivalent to food sovereignty.
Sure, and that's very clear. You made that point very clear. If I could pick up, I know that as a French man, it doesn't mean that you're automatically in line with what the French government is pushing during its presidency. But if I could pick your brains on les clauses miroirs, this idea of the mirror clauses, another key priority of the French presidency. Do you think that this is something that will gain traction? And do you think that les clauses miroirs, if they are to be introduced in our legislation, that they are WTO compliant?
Well, my answer is more on the French side than the previous one. It's yes, to some extent. Yes, because if we impose on European farm and food producers stringent standards for environment, climate, biodiversity compatibility, which others may not have in their own countries, then there is a risk of leakages of negative environment externalities on the one side, and there is a risk of putting our producers at a competitive disadvantage. So the call for mirrors is a reasonable one. It makes sense. But what is also true is that international trade law limits within a certain corridor the kind of restrictions that you can impose on your imports in the name of environment, food, or food precautionary standards. So it is not a blank check. And those of you who want more than this very short and synthetic response to your question can read the piece which Object de L'Or will publish. I think it's now in a few days, if I'm well informed as a VP of Object de L'Or. They will publish a new brief about this in the days to come, where this compatibility corridor between European standard clauses that apply on import and international trade law will be very precisely defined.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And a very warm thank you from Brussels. That is Mr. Pascal Lamy, President of the Paris Peace Forum, and as you said yourself correctly, the Vice President of Europe Jacques Delors, which you share with Geneviève Ponce, isn't that correct? Who spoke with us earlier. So give a round of applause, please, to Mr. Pascal Lamy. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.